My name is Linda Pansing. I'm one of the trustees for the Ohio Council of Skin and Scuba Divers Incorporated. We're a nonprofit, volunteer-driven organization made up of individual divers, dive clubs, businesses, all who support the council's mission of being an advocate for Ohio diving in promotional, legal, research, safety, education, and environmental matters. First, I want to start by saying how excited we are to have Dan Orr with us this evening. So thank you, Dan.
My pleasure.
Before we jump into everything, I do want to bring you up to date on some recent projects the council has been working on. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Huntington Division has proposed creating wetland areas in a couple locations in Lake Erie. We have requested consulting party status to keep informed and to be able to provide comment in order to protect any shipwrecks that may be located in or near those areas. On Saturday, June 25th, we're supporting the Bay Area Divers Cleanup Project at Lakeview Park in Port Clinton, Ohio. If you're interested in helping, you can sign up on the events section of greatlakes.org. We'll be holding Feed the Diver events at Circleville Twin Quarries on July 9th and White Star Quarry on July 16th. Come by for free food and support your local dive spots. Without us, they're not going to be there. Without them be there, we're not going to be diving. Check out our Facebook event page for more information on those two events. If you know of any college students that are pursuing marine-related degrees, please point them in our direction, because we are currently accepting applications for our Memorial Scholarship Program. Last year, Hannah Michelle, a student at Eastern Michigan University who is majoring in environmental science with a focus on hydrology, was awarded the scholarship. It's our plan to continue to grow the program, and we're actively pursuing ways to do this. One way is through the sale of Ohio Council t-shirts and polos. More information on this can be found on our Facebook page, and I want to thank the several people that have already purchased those t-shirts and polos. Another way to support the scholarship program is through the creation and sales of a dive-related license plate for Ohio. We're very happy to announce that Representative Jason Stevens of House District 93 has offered to be our bill sponsor, and we really just need your help with some more signatures of support. Information on the license plate project is pinned to the top of our Facebook page. We encourage you, your dive club or dive-related business to join the council. Per year, it's only $10 for an individual, $15 per family, $20 per club, and $25 per business. Membership links are included on our web and Facebook pages. By working together and supporting each other, I truly believe we can accomplish great things here in Ohio. Now for a few housekeeping notes. First, this session is being recorded and will be made available on the council's YouTube channel. Second, everyone will be muted. If you have a question during the program, please use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. Our presenter will answer as many questions as he can, and he's offered to stay on as long as he can in order to help answer your questions. Thanks again for joining us. And now I'm going to be introducing Dan Orr. Dan is president of Dan Orr Consulting, providing a variety of services to the diving community. Dan retired from the position of president of Divers Alert Network, also known as Dan. He has helped Dan focus on its worldwide diving safety mission. Prior to coming to Dan, he worked and taught recreational diving in a retail store, developed and implemented course curricula in the academic environment, collected data and supervised research efforts in the field of science diving, and tested dive equipment for military contractors. Dan has served on the boards of various not-for-profit organizations during his career, including the Historical Diving Society as president and chairman of the board, Diving Equipment and Marketing Association, DEMA, the chairman of the board, Academy of Underwater Arts and Sciences as the president, Force Blue as chairman of the board, Best Publishing Company chairman of the board, WCH Media Group chairman of the board, and the Institute of Diving. He has published and co-authored over 200 articles and a dozen books and manuals, including 101 Tips for Recreational Divers, Scuba Diving Safety, Pocket Guide to First Aid for Scuba Diving Injuries, Pocket Guide for Hazardous Marine Life Injuries, and the Dan Oxygen First Aid for Scuba Diving Injuries Training Manual. He has also been the recipient of many prestigious awards and honors, including the Nogi Award in Sports Education, the Leonard Greenstone Award for Diving Safety, the Our World Underwater Award, Beneath the Sea Diver of the Year, the Wyland Foundation Award for Lifetime Achievement, the Hall of Fame of Divers with Disabilities, the DEMA Reaching Out Award, inductee to the International Diving Hall of Fame, and the NAUI Hall of Honor. I want to thank you again, Dan, and we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Linda. I really appreciate it. It's great to be talking to folks in Ohio and wherever else you're from. The presentation tonight is entitled 5 Mistakes That Divers Make. A while back, I was actually giving a similar presentation to a group, and they had titled it The 5 Mistakes That Divers Make. And if it were only that simple, you simply avoid those 5 mistakes. But before I get started, what I'd like to do is actually talk a little bit about my background and history in Ohio. So we'll have a little bit of historical notes here. I actually grew up in the state of Florida and moved to Ohio in 1960. And in 1964, I became a certified diver at a dive store actually in Dayton, Ohio, and started diving all around the state after that. And shortly thereafter, I received, and I don't remember the exact date, but I received my Ohio Council qualified scuba diver patch that I proudly wore. And I became an instructor in 1972 and worked for a dive store called Keston Underwater Specialties in West Carrollton, Ohio. And I had received a YMCA certification, a PADI certification, and an Ohio Council instructor certification card. And also in probably around 1973, 1974, the Ohio Council had its annual banquet ball, which was a huge event down in Cincinnati. And during that event, I was crowned the king of the Ohio Council banquet ball. And you can see the ladies that are there, the court, and what they're doing. In fact, the lady on the left-hand side there is actually plying me with Boone's Farm apple wine. I also did some work for the city of Sandusky, doing some work in their breakwater. And when I went up there to do the work, it turns out they didn't have a boat. So they had to actually lower me down to the water in a scoop shovel, which was one of the more unique ways I've had of getting into and out of the water. I also did some work for a guy named Paul Webb, who was the world's expert in hypothermia, who had a lab in Yellow Springs, Ohio. And he contracted with me to test out the Navy's brand new crushed neoprene dry suit. In fact, that was actually the genesis of those kinds of dry suits that are being used around the world right now. And so I did that test actually at Portage Quarry up near Bowling Green. And I also tested out the first generation thin-slate undergarment. You can see that on the right-hand side there. And it really was, the thin-slate undergarment was kind of unique because there were only panels of thin-slate. It didn't really cover all the areas. And I had to dive with the suit flooded and also dry. So it was a very, very unique experience. And in 1973, I started the Wright State University Underwater Education Program, and their diving program there was one of the largest programs in the country, and certainly one of the most comprehensive diving programs anywhere. And in that program, we were also one of the first groups to certify disabled divers anywhere in North America. And we did that actually up until the time I left there in 1988. Also, something unique happened in 1981. I put together a NAUI instructor training course at Wright State. And the two guys that are pictured here on the right-hand side is Carl Huggins. And Carl Huggins is now the person who runs the chamber at Catalina in California. And the guy in the center is Craig Barshinger. The two of those guys got together in the evening after this ITC that I was doing. And they talked about Craig's idea of an electronic dive computer. And so what they wanted to do was create the world's first electronic dive computer. And from that meeting and subsequent meetings, including myself and a few other people, they developed the world's first electronic dive computer, the EDGE. And EDGE actually, and this is a bit of trivia is actually an acronym that stands for Electronic Dive Guide. And that's one of the contributions I made to that company. I'm the one that actually named that computer. So let's go on to our presentation, the 5 mistakes that divers make. So what is an accident? An accident is an occurrence or event that interrupts normal procedure or precipitates a crisis. And precipitates a crisis is important because if you do read accident reports, and I read all the ones I can get my hands on, you will see that some event took place that initiated a cascade of events that ultimately resulted in an emergency that could have resulted in an injury or fatality. Also, it's an undesirable or unfortunate happening that occurs unintentionally, even though when you read some of these reports, it may appear as though the person intentionally went out to hurt themselves, and usually results in harm, injury, damage, or loss, casualty, or a mistake. And that's what we're talking about this evening. And almost all of these accidents are preventable. If people simply made or had the correct response to what was happening, it wouldn't have initiated that cascade of events. Here we have a photo, actually was taken in 2018. I was diving in the Antarctic as part of a group that was down there doing some research. And that is a wreck called the Governor Norrin. The Governor Norrin was a whaling ship that caught fire in the early part of the 1900s. And in order to save the whale oil and the passengers on board and the crew, they ran it aground, and it's sitting upright on the surface, and the stern is down in about 60 feet of water, and the water temperature there is about 30 degrees, and I'm doing my level best to smile. But scuba diving is inherently safe. There's nothing about the sport itself that makes it unsafe, but even though you may read about that on the news or in USA Today, when somebody gets injured, it becomes big news. But it can be, and certainly is, very, very unforgiving of mistakes. So why do divers make mistakes? Because they have incomplete knowledge, not having all of the relevant facts. And that's one reason why it's so important to either listen to the dive master who's giving you a pre-dive briefing, or do complete research of the dive site you're going to, so you make sure you understand all the circumstances you're likely to experience at that dive or during that diving experience. Also, poor communication. And that's where people within a dive group don't share all of the relevant information that's important to all the people in that dive group. So it's very, very important to communicate everything you want to communicate to your diving companions during the planning phase. And you can continue using hand signals, of course, to communicate during the dive. Also, changing conditions, because conditions do change from the time you enter the water until the dive is over. And these changes can create some unfamiliar or unexpected circumstances that may really be beyond your capability as a diver. So you need to make sure that you anticipate as much as you can prior to beginning a dive. Also, pressure, and I'm talking about time pressure here, not water pressure or atmospheric pressure or ambient pressure. So time pressure is an issue, and in my opinion, in my feeling, I like to take a lot of time. I like to take as much time as I can to prepare myself, to make sure that I have everything under control before the dive starts. Sometimes people are pressured because they may be a little bit late getting to the dive site. And my personal philosophy is if you're on time, you're late. So they may be a little bit late getting to the dive site. They may not be moving as quickly as their companions when they prepare or configure their equipment prior to the dive. So don't let anybody pressure you into doing things faster than you feel comfortable with. Also, peer pressure. There are times when you decide, and that decision really is up to you. You decide whether or not you're going to dive. And there are people who may say, well, you know, you should dive anyway. Well, don't let anybody pressure you into a dive. And there is a circumstance that I've thought about over and over again. After I left Wright State, I went to Florida State University as the associate dive safety officer down there. And there were a lot of people that were friends of ours that were divers, and they went diving on the weekend. And one of the guys was a great young man named Sherwood Shiley. And Sherwood was a fantastic guy. He was an honor student at Florida State. And he and his diving companions over the weekend were going to be doing a very long push back into a cave system. They were going to extend the cave line that was already in there thousands of feet. And it was a 2-day dive that they were going to do. So after the first day, they were sitting around the fire that night, and Sherwood said, you know, I just don't think I really want to make this next dive. I think it's really a little bit more difficult for me than I thought it was going to be. So I'm going to sit the next dive out. And they convinced him that he should make the dive the next day. And unfortunately, he died on that dive. So complexity is also an issue. So if you look at the photo here, that photo was taken of me on a dive in the Beagle Channel in Argentina. And I was there I was there for almost a week before we did our trip to the Antarctic. And what I wanted to do, I wanted to make sure that I was doing a few prep dives before I went to Antarctica, because I want to make sure if something was happening or I wasn't really comfortable with some of the equipment, I could actually deal with all of that in a much more benign condition, rather than being in a very remote area like the Antarctic, where if something happens, it would literally take days to get us back to any assistance. So you need to make sure that you understand that some dives can be overly complex, either because the equipment that's being used or the procedures are being used or the circumstances surrounding the dive. And what that does, when all those things are going on, that creates something called task loading. And task loading is where so many things are happening at one time that you're having a difficult time dealing with it. And sometimes that can precipitate an emergency. And you want to make sure that you take your time to practice the skills so that you're comfortable when you're in unusual circumstances. And I have what I call my rule of three. And my rule of three is, if I make 3 mistakes during my dive preparation, that includes configuring my equipment, I stop and rethink my readiness for that dive. And when we were diving in the Antarctic, we had the luxury of having an unused helicopter hangar on the back of the icebreaker that we were on, and it was heated, so it was fantastic. So we could actually put our equipment together, configure it, and I would go up there literally an hour or more before the dive and get my equipment together. And on one particular dive, I was up there configuring my equipment, and I made a number of mistakes, and I decided to rethink my readiness for the dive and decided not to do the dive that day. So it's something you really need to do, because the final decision to dive or not dive is really absolutely up to you and no one else. When a safe diver makes a mistake, they have the skills and knowledge to keep it from ruining a perfectly good dive. So we all make mistakes. That's an absolute. We're human beings. But we want to make sure we learn from those mistakes, and we make sure that we use our skills to deal with the situation and then continue the dive. So it's kind of like, if you think about the last dive you made, or any dive you made, you're swimming along and all of a sudden something happens. And whatever happens, you have the skills and knowledge to deal with it. You deal with it, and you go on. But if there are people who have not as much experience or skill that you have, they may not be able to deal successfully with what happened, and that could precipitate an accident. So let's talk about risk, because risk really is one of the things we're talking about here in this program. So one of the things that Divers Alert Network did many years ago is they went to insurance companies when they decided to start diving accident insurance. And they went to a number of insurance companies around the country, and they said, we want to provide an insurance policy to scuba divers. And after some of those companies stopped laughing, they said, well, we think diving is unsafe. And people from Dan said, well, we think diving is safe. So the insurance company said, prove it. Well, the problem was, it was difficult to prove that it was safe, because we may have an idea, a reasonably good idea, of the number of fatalities and somewhat of an idea of the number of injuries, but nobody knew how many safe dives were made. So we didn't have the denominator in that equation. So what Dan decided to do a number of years ago was to find out what the incidence of injury and the risks really were. And so we actually had interns that we sent all over the world to different diving areas and different diving platforms to have them collect data from dive computers, download that data into a database, and then follow the divers through the week of diving and then post-dive to see if they had any symptoms that were related to the dives they made. Now, the first group that we sent these, or the first place we sent these researchers to, or interns to, excuse me, were liveaboards. So we sent these interns, and they had tough duty to go to a liveaboard and spend a week or so on a liveaboard, but they collected almost 20,000 dive profiles and determined that the incidence of injury was about 1 per 10,000 open water dives. Now, we kind of use that as the baseline, because when you think about liveaboard diving, it really is about as safe as it can be, because on that liveaboard, you have people that are there that do nothing but give you all the information you need to make decisions that you and your diving companions have to make it a safe dive. So you have dive briefings every day. They tell you everything they need to tell you about the dive. They actually park the dive boat over top of the dive site, so you don't have any long surface swims. and you have people on board that are there to help you understand the equipment you may not be familiar with. You have people that are there to check your equipment. You have people that are actually physically in the water with you to make sure if something happens, there's somebody there to help you. You have people that keep you from doing stupid things like jumping in the water with your air turned off. So you have all of those things in place to make those dives as safe as they possibly can be. And the same thing goes for people who are diving from day charters, where you have a dive master on board, you have dive masters in the water. So the same thing happens. So this kind of diving is about as safe as it can be. And we use that as the baseline. And so liveaboard diving is one incident per 10,000 open water dives. Well, then we sent interns to places where people were doing shore diving or charter boat diving or diving from their own personal watercraft, where they didn't have all of the resources available to them. They had to do all the research themselves. They had to learn about the dive sites themselves. They didn't have anybody necessarily in the water with them who was there to make sure that their dives were safe dives. So we collected about 16,000 dive profiles, and not surprisingly, the incidence of injury was about 3 times higher. Then we also looked at dive professionals, and these are people who are instructors, assistant instructors, dive masters, people who are there, who are supervising dives, and people who are there for the benefit and welfare of other divers. So we collected over 5,000 dive profiles, and the incidence of injury was much higher, at about 10 per 10,000 open water dives. When you think about it, of course, that makes some sense, because these people are actually doing a lot of ascents and descents, doing a lot more diving than individual divers may do. They may be doing rapid movement from one place to another when they're trying to help people. So they're doing a lot of things that do increase their risk. Now, when I was at Florida State, we were actually doing this kind of diving almost every single day, because we were training science divers, supervising science divers. And so we were doing a lot of diving, and my staff, one thing we did to mitigate that risk was actually had them breathe nitrox using air computers or air dive tables back in those days. And that gave them a little bit of safety factor and reduced that risk somewhat. Then we also looked at people who would probably be called technical divers today. And these are cold water divers, deep wreck divers who are doing a lot of physical labor and in really, really tough conditions. We collected about 5,000 dive profiles, and the incidence of injury was 29 times higher than people diving from liveaboards. And when you think about that, of course, that makes sense because of all the physical labor they're doing. They're doing a lot more work than other divers would do, but they can and do mitigate those risks by using different gas mixtures, using different decompression algorithms, using different types of decompression techniques. So there are a lot of things that can be done to mitigate those risks, but you can see, depending upon the dive platform, risks can be different. We also, of course, at Divers Alert Network, looked at fatalities and published that information in the annual diving report. And when you looked at fatalities in the 2017 data that was published in 2019, there were 70 US and Canadians who were involved in diving fatalities and 162 worldwide. But when you think about the fact that there are literally tens of millions of open water dives being done, that still indicates that diving is relatively safe. And if you look at just simply the chance of a fatality, it's about 1 fatality in every 211,864 dives, and that came from the 2018 annual diving report. So there are other things that people do, though, to get themselves in trouble that don't necessarily involve diving. So, for example, when you look at sports deaths, and these are sports deaths that were published in Men's Journal in July of 2009, and that's the number of deaths per 1,000 participants over a 5-year period. The most dangerous thing by far was mountain climbing, and in case somebody in K2, where it was 104 fatalities per 1,000 participants over a 5-year period. And there are other things, for example, like base jumping, that are also extremely dangerous.
You might question the sanity of these 2 guys who decided to pull off an illegal urban wingsuit stunt in Rio de Janeiro. As you can see, the men were Red Bull wingsuit daredevils. They actually successfully threaded the needle between 2 skyscrapers in Rio. One of the daredevils attempted to fly by one of Brazil's famous monuments. Unfortunately for him, that was his final.
Well, that that could certainly result in an injury and not anything you would really expect. But base jumping is, of course, risky, and it's 44 fatalities per 1,000 participants over a 5-year period. Then looking at rodeo bull riding, 8.7, I happen to live in the state of Idaho, and here bull riding and rodeo work is one of the things that are actually part of people's lives here. And this is a photo I took a couple of summers ago at a junior rodeo where a poor kid was bucked off of a small bull and did a face plant there in the arena. Hang gliding can be also risky, 3.8 fatalities per 1,000 participants. Skydiving, 3.3 fatalities per 1,000 participants. ATV riding, where the wheels really do come off, 0.5 fatalities per 1,000 participants. Scuba diving, way down the list, 0.06 fatalities. And backcountry skiing, I do live actually just below a ski resort here in Idaho. And those things happen all the time. In fact, we see the helicopter flying in and out of there all the time. And I actually took ski lessons years ago and decided not to do it when they kept bringing injured people through the ski lessons. So I decided scuba diving is a lot safer than any of these other things. So let's talk about the mistakes now. The first mistake I'm going to talk about is not practicing critical diving and emergency skills. Now, when you think about that, think about your scuba course that you took, the first scuba course, and think about the time after that. And how many times after you took your scuba course did you actually practice the skills you learned in the course? How many times did you practice, especially the emergency skills, where you're jettisoning your weights or you're practicing the exchange of breathing gas in an emergency and doing an emergency ascent of some sort where you're exchanging breathing gas? So think about when you practice that the last time. And if you haven't practiced a long time, most people don't, it's going to be very difficult for you to use that in a real crisis situation. So when you look at the DAN data, again, the fatality data, 39% of the people in the fatality database were certified for 1 year or less. Now that makes some sense because they have very limited skills, very limited experience to draw from in case something happens. 35% of the people in the fatality database were certified for more than 10 years. And I can tell you that that really doesn't mean a whole lot. In fact, it means nothing at all. It simply means that those people had carried a certification card in their wallet or their purse for 10 years or longer. It doesn't have anything to do with their recent experience or the experiences they had. It's simply time where the certification card is being held by them. And a significant number of divers died on the first dive of their dive trip. And in fact, when I gave this presentation and mentioned that, somebody in the audience said, well, the way to solve that problem is simply skip the first dive. Well, that may sound like it works, but it really doesn't. And when you think about that, though, the reason I think that's a problem is because there are people who are coming back to the sport who haven't been involved in diving for a long time, either because of family obligations or career obligations. They got certified, had to stop diving for a long time, and they want to come back. And so a lot of those people come back at a level far beyond their capabilities, and they get themselves in trouble. In fact, here's an entry being done by a guy who's not holding in onto his mask, and chances are his mask is going to flood when he hits the water, which could then precipitate an emergency. So give you a case history. Diver ran out of air at 60 feet of water. This was an absolutely perfect diving day. Water was flat calm, visibility over 100 feet, water temperature over 80 degrees. And it was a group of people, friends who were diving together, and one of them ran out of air at 60 feet. The person's buddy, or the person nearest them, because they really were using the same ocean buddy system, but the person nearest them, their buddy, attempted to share air. And that was the second dive of the day. And from this experience, both the diver and the person they were attempting to share air with were found on the bottom. The buddy, the person they were attempting to share air with, still had 1,200 PSI in their scuba cylinder. The critical thing, in my opinion, when I hear something like this, I look and see what dive of the day it was. This was the second dive of the day. And that means to me that the person who ran out of breathing gas on a relatively shallow, relatively short duration dive did not change tanks from that first dive. Possible issues here: no recent familiarity with critical skills, because exchanging breathing gas underwater is a complex psychomotor skill that requires practice. No pre-dive equipment check. Had there been one, somebody would have said something about the fact that person did not have a full cylinder of breathing gas. No checklist or pre-dive ritual. Checklists are very important to make sure that you're not forgetting anything. I took this photo actually at a quarry in North Carolina a number of years ago. It was a guy who had just come out of the water. And you can see how he had his octopus or safe second or whatever you want to call it configured so it wasn't dragging behind, but it was up under all of those straps and buckles. And there's no way in the world that person can deploy that quickly enough to satisfy the person in front of them who is out of breathing gas. And what's going to happen is probably what happened with the other divers I just mentioned, is somebody's going to rip the regulator out of that person's mouth because they know that one is working and there's breathing gas coming from it. Now, one of the other things that Dan did that I think is probably one of the most important research projects they were ever involved in was they did a review of all of the complete fatality records they had in their database. And this was, these were fatality records between 1992 and 2003. And this report was published in 2008. But in those years, between 1992 and 2003, Dan had collected complete information on almost 1,000 fatality cases. And they had enough information to be able to determine what the steps were that resulted in a fatality. And this was published and done by Dr. Petar Denoble, who was the research director at the time at Dan. And it again was from 2008. It was called Causes of Recreational Diving Fatalities. And at the end of the presentation, I'm going to give you my email address, and I'll be happy to send you a copy of that article if you can't find it. So one of the things they determined out of this research project, what I think are some of the most important things, are the initial triggering events. So what caused a dive, an uneventful dive, to all of a sudden turn into a fatality or a serious injury? And in this particular case, fatalities. So when they looked at the initial triggering events, 41% of those triggering events were running out of breathing gas underwater. 41%, which makes no sense to me at all, because with all of the technology we have, computers and air integrated computers and pressure gauges and all kinds of things, we should never be in a situation where we run out of breathing gas underwater. But it happened in 41% of these cases. That's over 400 people. I mean, it makes no sense at all. So when you look at all the trigger events, they're out of breathing gas underwater, entrapment where people have gone where they shouldn't go, equipment problems. I personally do not think, and I've reviewed all of this data, I don't think it's equipment problems. That to me implies there's a design flaw with the equipment, and the equipment we're using these days is really very, very good. I think it actually is problems with equipment. I think it's user error rather than anything that's a design issue with the equipment itself. And then rough water, trauma, buoyancy, inappropriate gas. Actually, about 63% of all of those trigger events have to do with, in some way, equipment or equipment use. Also looking at Dan data, the number of years since initial certification. And by the way, that photo is a photo of me at Sportsman's Lake in Cedarville, Ohio in 1969. But this data has the number of years the person involved in a fatality had since their initial certification, which in reality doesn't mean a whole lot. Because again, it has nothing to do with the number of dives they made, the last dive they made, the quality of the dives they made, or any of those circumstances, simply the number of years the person had been carrying a certification card. What I think is more important is this, that is the number of dives the person had in the 12 months prior to the fatality. So when you look at that, there's a peak here, excuse me, at between 1 and 19 dives. So again, people who are early on in their certification and do not have a lot of experience. They have limited experience and knowledge and tools to draw from in case something serious happens during the dive. But when you go to the right-hand side, you can see here that you have a peak at people who had made 300 dives or more in the preceding 12 months and still were involved in the fatality database. So that is probably due to something like complacency, or something that I'm going to talk more about later on in this presentation, called normalization of deviance. And I'll be talking a little bit about that near the end of the presentation. So when you look at the data and you see that there were these 4 steps that were involved in a fatality, you had the triggering event that caused something to happen, and then you had a harmful action where the person reacted and did not do the right thing. And so that actually led to an injury that incapacitated the diver and then ultimately the cause of death. So if we could figure out a way to make sure that we make the right decisions, then we have a triggering event, which happens all the time during dives. We make the right decision and we go on, and it doesn't continue on in that cascade towards eternity. And you want to make sure that you make the right decision so everything else doesn't happen. Okay, mistake number 2, not using a pre-dive checklist or a consistent pre-dive ritual. a number of years ago, Dan put together, along with Patty and a few other groups, put together a rebreather forum down in the state of Florida. And they were talking about rebreathers, but they did a lot of things that applied to diving in general. And one of them was the importance of a checklist. So out of that, it was determined that a checklist is one of the most important safety things you can do, and that every diver on every dive should in some fashion use a checklist. And I also like a consistent pre-dive ritual. I go through the same basic steps every time I do a dive, and I make sure that I do that each and every time I dive. And checklists are very important, and checklists are all around. I mean, you can find checklists everywhere, and we'll talk about that in just a minute, but let's talk about a case history here. A diver attempted to put air into his buoyancy compensator during what he perceived to be an emergency situation. Could not put air in the BC. Push the button, push the button, push the button. Nothing happened. No air went into the BC. The diver drowned. Possible issues. The BCD inflator was not completely connected. So when the person put the BC hose together, he didn't make sure that the connection was a firm, complete connection by pushing the button after the connection was made to make sure air flows into the BCD. And so when it came time to use it, it wasn't completely connected. No air went out of the regulator, out of the cylinder into the BCD. No pre-dive equipment check. Had they had a pre-dive equipment check, that would have been something they would have identified. No use of a checklist or pre-dive ritual. So, and the buddies, of course, were not working effectively together because they would have made sure that all of the equipment was functioning properly before they ever got in the water. So checklists, you can find checklists online. You can find them that'll go on your telephone. You can print them out from a variety of different sources. So checklists are very important, and not one checklist is going to work for every diver in every circumstance. So there are basic things you probably have, but then you may want to add other things. And I have checklists upon checklists. I have checklists to make sure that I take the right gear to a dive trip. I just got back from a dive trip to Tasmania. I had a very extensive checklist to make sure everything went, and a checklist that I used to make sure everything came back. So I didn't leave anything behind. Excuse me. Safety preparation. Prepare yourself and your partners and your equipment with a checklist and a consistent pre-dive ritual. And you need to make sure that you're diving your recent experience, not your certification card. It really doesn't make any difference what it says on your certification. What's important are your skills and the recency of your skills and the quality of your skills and the ability to use your skills in an emergency situation. So recently practiced skills and experience are essential, because water, your certification card means nothing. It's not going to help you out. What's going to help you out is going to be your skills. What's going to make that dive a tremendous, enjoyable experience are your skills and abilities and the confidence you have because you know your skills are good. So properly execute each dive as a buddy team and consider contingencies. So my buddies and I talk about a lot of stuff before the dive, and we talk about, well, you know, last time I was here, this happened, and I was able to deal with it this way, or we're in a situation here, and how do we deal with that? And so we do a lot of talking before and after the dives. You also need to be situationally aware. Situational awareness is one of the most important things a diver can use. And that is making sure you understand your breathing gas supply and the fact that it changes during the dive. And you need to communicate that change to your diving companions. So you need to make sure you understand how to do that so that everybody understands where everybody is as far as their breathing gas supply is concerned. And nobody is surprised by having somebody all of a sudden show up in front of them saying, I'm out of air, I want some of yours. Bottom time relative to the dive plan. So you make sure that you know what hand signals people use for saying it's time to turn the dive. And in fact, I do a lot of traveling in different parts of the world, and there are different groups that use different hand signals, and sometimes they're very confusing. So make sure that you and your partners review those hand signals so you can understand where you are relative to the dive plan and your breathing gas supply. You have to monitor your depth, your currents, visibility, and all those things may change. Also your position and location relative to the exit and the entry point, because you want to make sure you don't have a long surface swim back to your dive boat. And the overhead conditions, because those can also change. So you monitor that to make sure you're not going to come up in the middle of boat traffic or anything else that happens during the dive that could compromise your safety or change or increase your risk. And you also need to learn from each and every dive. So safe divers don't waste a good mistake. And again, we all make mistakes. We learn from the mistakes we make, and we share that learning experience with others. So I make mistakes like everybody, and when the dive is over, I'll talk to my about this. I should have done that, and This should be the way we do it in the future. And so all of that is part of the evolution that you go through to become and continue to be a better diver. Mistake number 3, not communicating effectively with your buddy or diving companions. Case history, diver in distress attempted to jettison his integrated weights. He was unsuccessful because he didn't know how. This was a diver who'd been certified for, I believe, 5 or 6 years. And during those 5 or 6 years, he'd made a number of open water dives. And during those diving experiences, he had never put weights in, nor ever taken weights out of his buoyancy compensator by himself. It was always done by somebody else, always done by a dive master or a diving companion. He never did it himself. He had no clue on how to remove those weights in an emergency. The diver drowned. Possible issues, no pre-dive communication with the buddy, which would help him understand how to jettison those weights. In fact, I was on a liveaboard a couple of years ago, and I was renting a buoyancy compensator rather than carrying it halfway around the world. And it was a BC that I hadn't used before. And so my dive buddy and I practiced the removal of those weight pockets for probably a good 45 minutes to an hour to make sure we understood exactly how I would jettison those if it happened to me as a diver, or how my partner could jettison those if I was in trouble. So again, no pre-dive communication with the buddy, no pre-dive equipment familiarization, because that way the person would have known how to jettison those weights, incomplete buddy equipment check, and possible limited quick release options. And there are buoyancy compensators now that have a very complicated system to remove integrated weights in an emergency. So you need to make sure you're aware how to do that. And on this trip to Tasmania, I was actually using since I was using a dry suit, the water temperature is about 58 degrees. I was using a weight harness and it has pull handles that you use to remove those weights. And so I was practicing to make sure I knew how to do that in case there was an emergency. So communicate with your diving partners. I mean, that's one of the best things you can ever do to make sure that everybody is on the same dive plan and everybody understands what they should know to make the dive a safe dive and an enjoyable dive. So communication is extremely important. Mistake number 4, not taking care of your health. That's one of the most important issues nowadays, safety issues in diving. So as we talked about before, when Dan did that root cause analysis of those 947 fatalities, and they determined that out of breathing gas was the #1 triggering event. In 2015, Dan did a review of additional fatalities to see if all of those or any of those had changed. And in 2015, the data they found was that the #1 issue now was an underlying health issue. Cardiac events especially are one of the biggest killers in the diving community. And it's important to understand that it's now replaced out of breathing gas as the #1 triggering event in diving fatalities. Case history, 54-year-old certified advanced diver. It was the first open water dive that he had made in 7 years. When he entered the water, he had his snorkel in his mouth instead of his regulator. He hit the water, tried to take a breath, got water, struggled at the surface, became unresponsive, and died of a cardiac event. Excuse me. So he died of cardiac arrest. He'd had no recent physical. He'd had no cardiac stress test in a number of years. And having been away from the sport for quite a long time, one thing he definitely should have done is to take a refresher course and probably maybe return to diving physical. So when you talk about cardiac issues, in 2017, and the data that Dan published in 2017, they determined that autopsy results were available in 29 diving-related fatalities, because sometimes autopsy results are not available, and the physician will simply list the diver as drowned because they're wet, they're dead, therefore they drown, without going any further. In 16 of those, or 55.2%, the cause of the death or the disabling condition was identified as an acute cardiac event. So cardiac issues are a significant problem in diving today. Excuse me. So diving exposes divers' bodies, our bodies, to various stressors that may contribute to an arrhythmia or an irregular heartbeat. The major stressors that could initiate an arrhythmia are immersion, exposure to cold, increased work of breathing. And of course, we recognize that. That's diving. There's nothing we can do about immersion. Exposure to cold, we can do something about that to mitigate that risk or reduce that risk by having the appropriate exposure protection. So on this trip to the Antarctic, I had a polar weight undergarment that I was using. A number of people there were using actually heated undergarments. There was on the trip to Tasmania, I was also using a polar fleece undergarment and also trying to keep my hands as dry as I could to reduce the likelihood of exposure to cold, and also increase work of breathing by having your regulator tuned properly. So if you have a properly tuned regulator, that's going to reduce your work of breathing, and that's going to reduce the likelihood of an arrhythmia. And also emotional stress. This concerns me a lot because, excuse me, because you have divers who've been out of the water for a long time because of COVID. There are divers who haven't been out of in the water for at least 2 years, sometimes 3 years or more. And now they want to come back to the water after 2 or 3 or 4 years of non-diving. And that can create some level of emotional stress. That, coupled with the other things, can precipitate an arrhythmia that can then cause a cardiac event to occur. So the signs and symptoms of a potential cardiac event would be things like pain, fullness, a squeezing sensation in the chest. Those are things you would expect, but other things like headache, arm pain, shortness of breath, nausea, vomiting, general ill feeling, you may not really think about, or things like jaw pain. For example, if you watch daytime television, Susan Lucci, who is a TV actress, she has had 2 major cardiac events, and one of them, the only symptom she had was jaw pain. And she luckily recognized that a potential problem, went to the hospital, and therefore was diagnosed with a potential cardiac issue. 25% of those folks had no signs or symptoms whatsoever of an impending cardiac event that led to a fatality. So if there is a cardiac event, the first aid for that incident is remove the diver from water. CPR, of course, AED, an automated external defibrillator if it's available. And AEDs may not be available at all dive sites or on all dive boats. It's kind of like when Dan introduced the oxygen program. That was actually my job when I first came to Dan, was to create the Dan oxygen program. And our mantra was to have an oxygen unit at every dive site and on every dive boat, and somebody qualified to use it. And so the same thing really should apply to AEDs, considering the fact that a significant portion of the active diving population are people well over 40 or even 50, then AEDs are probably a good thing to have at all dive sites and people trained in their use. And also contact the emergency medical services in that area for assistance. So safety considerations: remember, any sudden or noticeable changes in your health should initiate some contact with your physician. And these can be changes either in physical health or your mental health. And it's not a bad idea, and I recommend divers have an annual physical if you're over the age of 45, and that annual physical should include a periodic cardiac stress test. I'm actually going through a whole series of my annual physicals right now, going through a number of different tests, and I have a cardiac stress test that's scheduled here in a couple of weeks, and I want to make sure I do that as often as I can because I want to make sure I'm in good health so I can continue diving for a long time. And that annual physical should be from a medical professional who is familiar with diving and your life priorities. Your life priorities are very important because you want to make sure that the physician understands how important the sport is to you. And it shouldn't be so important that it puts you or other people at risk. But there are physicians who may not understand anything about diving medicine and therefore say it's probably a good idea for you just to stop diving. Well, if they understand that diving is very important to you, they're going to probably learn more about it so they can make the right decisions or help you make the right decisions for your future in diving. And also don't forget Divers Alert Network, because your physician can contact Dan and talk to the medical department there and get information that they can use to help make the appropriate recommendations to you as a patient. Also, Dan has a physician referral network for physicians all over North America of all specialties. And all you have to do is call them during their working hours, 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, and they can give you the name of a physician near you that you can go to or your physician can liaise with to help you make those medical decisions. Safe divers should adhere to safety and conservative practices. So the older I get, and I'm 74 years old right now, but the older I get, the more conservative I get because I want to continue to enjoy diving for a long time. And dive within your limits and experience. Again, dive your recent experience, not just your certification card. And avoid diving conditions that may exceed your recent experience or abilities. my diving buddy and I were actually on a liveaboard diving Socorro a couple of years ago. Got up one morning and the wind was howling and there was about 6-foot waves out there. And he and I looked at each other and we said, nope, not today. And so we enjoyed the day sitting up there on the sun deck and enjoying watching other people dive. But we decided it really was not a day that we wanted to take advantage of the sport. And other people did, but it was our decision not to dive. Also, I recommend, especially older divers, use nitrox rather than air. In fact, I haven't breathed air, except in my daily life, in years when diving. And in fact, on this trip to Tasmania, all the dives I made were on nitrox. But I would recommend using an enriched air nitrox blend with your dive computer set on the air setting, or if you're using dive tables, using air tables. Now, what that'll do is that will give you a safety factor because you're breathing less nitrogen than the tables or the computer would allow for. But you have to understand that it's so popular now with older divers that they've nicknamed it geezer gas. And that's okay. I don't mind them calling, hey, you're breathing geezer gas. That's fine with me. But I think nitrox is probably a good thing for people to use, especially older divers when they're diving. But you have to understand the use and limitations of nitrox. So if you're going to use nitrox, you need to take a nitrox specialty course in order to understand the benefits and limitations of diving with that gas, because it certainly is not a deep diving gas, which is okay with me because I don't really do deep dives anymore. I want to be able to have long bottom times and enjoy the sport as much as I can. So safe divers should use the most conservative options. Scuba diving is, of course, the sport that invented social distancing. And you want to make sure that you can enjoy the sport for as long as possible. Practice slow ascents, including safety stops. And over on the right-hand side there, I'm doing my safety stop. I'm actually diving with a companion in the Bahamas. And that companion happened to be Dr. Jose Jones, who's a co-founder of the National Association of Black Scuba Divers. And Dr. Jones, you can see behind me, is in the full lotus position. And you can see that I'm not. I tried to get my legs up there and I could not do it. I'm not nearly as flexible as he is. Be situationally aware. In other words, making sure you understand your breathing gas supply, your bottom time, your depth, current, visibility, position, location relative to the entry and exit point, your workload, overhead conditions, all those things that you need to be aware of to make the appropriate decisions for you during those dives. Also carry safety and signaling equipment. Here is a photo. I was diving with Bob Evans, who's the founder and creator of Force Fins. And Bob and I were showing off what we call our safety sausages, or the Dan version of that is a surface signaling kit. And the Dan version is unique because one thing we did when I was there, we created that device with a metallic strip. So it's visible on radar. As far as I know, it's the only surface signaling device that is visible on radar. Also, you can have things like a surface float, which is not a bad idea. And there are electronic devices you can use to help you in an emergency. And this is one called the Nautilus Lifeline. Now, I don't work for Nautilus. I get nothing at all from that company. But I think it's a great device because it's electronic. As soon as you come to the surface, you can initiate a signal that goes to all the dive boats nearby that actually is a signal initiating a man overboard response. And it gives your position. It's a GPS system, gives your position within 1 meter. And here I am actually diving in the Philippines, and I'm wearing my Nautilus Lifeline. Also, take a break after multiple days of diving. And don't be afraid to ask for help, because if you're on a dive boat, you're paying people to help you. And so don't be afraid if you are tired or something to ask for assistance, getting into the water, getting out of the water, putting your gear on, ask for help if necessary. Have an easy exit ladder with a pull-up bar, makes it a lot easier to get in and out of the water. You can don and doff your equipment in the water if necessary. You can consider using different equipment options, like, for example, side mounts. I recommend for older people who may have back issues to use side mounts because you can simply clip them on in the water. In fact, there's a guy I read about who is now creating a program specifically for older divers on how to use side mounts, or use smaller cylinders that don't weigh as much. So safe divers should not be afraid to say no. That's the best thing you have going for you. All you have to do is say no. So remember, anybody can call a dive for any reason at any time, even before the dive begins. All you've got to do is raise that thumb and the dive is over. That's one of the most important things I ever learned in cave diving. When the thumb comes up, the dive is over and everybody exits. So if you're returning to diving from a long absence, divers should, and this is a photo actually taken of me actually in Indiana at Forest Lake in Ridgeville, Indiana. And you need to make sure that you're realistic about your health status. And if you have any questions, make sure you see a health professional or contact the medical department at Dan. If you suspect that or know that you've been affected with COVID, which is a big issue now about returning to diving post-COVID, immediately contact your primary care physician. Consult with the folks at Divers Alert Network. They're collecting information on people who've had COVID who are diving and have been diving. There are articles and resources out there. Dr. Doug Ebersol wrote an article that was published in Dive Newswire about diving after COVID. He actually had COVID and recovered and is now diving regularly. He also has a YouTube video that's available about diving after COVID. And also Dr. David Sharish has a YouTube video on diving medical fitness in the era of COVID-19, what every diver should know. Those are resources you can contact. Do a return to diving physical with a physician familiar with diving medicine and your life priorities. And of course, you can consult the diving medical department at Dan. So refresh your skills and knowledge before you return to the sport if you've been out for a long time. And I actually wrote an article about a year or so ago that was published in Dive Newswire called Time to Return to Diving, but cautiously, because you need to be aware of the potential of skill degradation. And the issue is because the skills, especially the critical psychomotor skills involved in dealing with a diving emergency, do degrade over time. There's no research into diving skill degradation as far as scuba diving is concerned, but there is a lot of research on those complex skills in paramedics because they've seen some decline in advanced life support performance after 6 weeks. For nurses, they've seen a 70% decline in advanced cardiac life support after 3 months, and as much as an 86% decline after 12 months, and pilots, a significant decline in psychomotor skills after 1 to 4 months of not flying. So if you're returning to diving from a long absence, refresh your skills and knowledge, take a refresher course, dive with an instructor, start with benign dives where you have a lot of bottom reference, dive at a familiar location, and be conservative and cautious. So continue to play your part, wear a mask, go diving as often as you can. And mistake number 5, not accepting personal responsibility for your own safety. Case history, rebreather diver boasted about superior knowledge and skill the night before doing a CCR dive. And he said that he didn't need a checklist. His CCR prep was intuitive. And he was found the next morning unconscious in 15 feet of water right at the end of the dock. They couldn't tell really whether he was breathing or not, because of course there shouldn't be any bubbles coming out of his CCR. So they jumped in the water and grabbed him. Turns out that he had just passed out and they were able to resuscitate him and get him back to the surface alive. And the possible issues, not following preparation protocols. He had not turned on the oxygen unit in his rebreather. He did not use a checklist, and he did not accept personal responsibility for his own safety. So let's talk a little bit about responsibility. It's a state or fact of being responsible, answerable, or accountable for something that's within our power to control. And that goes back to the fact that diving safety is really our responsibility. So within one's power, control, or management. And it really is a contraction of 2 words, response and ability. So in other words, it's our ability to respond to circumstances, and it's our ability to respond appropriately at each decision point. And literally, we're making decisions constantly during a dive. And our choices are then moving us forward and towards a successful and safe outcome. And that's what we want. We want a successful and safe and enjoyable outcome from a dive. So that responsibility is indeed ours. So why do accidents occur in the first place? A culture that permits mistakes to go uncorrected. Uncorrected or bad or poor behavior and skills. And this thing called normalization of deviance. I had an opportunity to, I was working actually for a liveaboard, and as part of that, I listened to the NTSB recommendations from their investigation of the Conception disaster, which was horrific. I listened to the entire 3 hours plus of their investigation. And one term that stuck in my mind was this concept of normalization of deviance. And that's something that is a deviation from standard operating procedure that becomes normalized over time. So we've deviated from normal operating procedure. If you think about the Challenger disaster, they knew the O-rings did not perform well when they were cold, but they decided to launch anyway. They launched and it worked. So they launched again and it worked. But then once they launched and it didn't work. And also the Columbia disaster, where they knew the heat shields and the heat tiles were not necessarily staying in place, but it worked, and they continued to do it until it didn't work. So the same thing happens in diving, where people will change or deviate from standard operating procedures because they're taking a shortcut and it works. And so they are rewarded because it worked, and they continue to do it. And it continues to work until it doesn't. So it becomes a normal operating procedure, and those shortcuts will work until they don't. And sometimes when they don't, the result is catastrophic. So poor decision-making, not taking personal responsibility for our safety, and ultimately safety is up to us and no one else. Poor planning and preparation for diving, especially when returning to diving from a long absence. And let me tell you what I call the 4 Ps of scuba diving safety: plan, prepare, practice, and practice a lot, and perform. You need to make sure that you do all of those things and continue to do all of those things to make sure that all the dives you make are not only safe, but enjoyable. You don't want some error, some issue, some mistake to take away from the enjoyment of the dive. So learning from our mistakes and the mistakes of others has the power to make us better and safer than we were before. And that all helps in our continued evolution as a safe diver. And if you fail to prepare, you are preparing to fail. And you need to make sure that you prepare, especially if you're going a long distance, like when I was going to Tasmania. That's a long way away, because the further you are away from help, the more difficult it's going to be to deal with that situation. Houston, we've got a problem. So scuba diving safety is no accident. And I'm going to warn you right now, I have a couple of slides here that are a blatant promotional alert. And that is because my wife and I just published an ebook at the end of last year called 101 Tips for Recreational Scuba Diving. And it's actually more than 101 tips, because I couldn't stop at 101, which is not surprising to a lot of people. And it's available as an ebook from Apple Books, and available from Amazon, and also from wisedivers.com. Also, a number of years ago, I wrote a book with Eric Douglas. He and I were working at Dan at the time, but we did this on our own time, and it's called Scuba Diving Safety, and it's available from Best Publishing. And then I had a number of articles that were written and published in Dive Newswire, including normalization of deviance, return to diving but cautiously, and also a crisis lurking below the surface. It has to do with the emergency hyperbaric treatment availability, because there are fewer, many fewer, very few chambers available compared to what they used to be. There used to be dozens of chambers available in Florida. Now there are only a few. So if something happens, you may not be able to be treated as quickly as you had been in the past. Plus returning to dive travel, part 1 and 2, and also COVID-19, local diving, and the older diver. So if you have any questions, I will hang around as long as you want me to. And this is my email address. And even after this presentation's over, maybe next week or next month or next year, you have a question, be sure you email me. I'll do my best to help you answer that question. And my email address is danorr@danorrconsulting.com. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Dan. We really appreciate all of your years of knowledge. 74, it can be.
Yeah, and it's getting more enjoyable all the time, actually, because I'm taking my time and I'm slowing down and enjoying every minute underwater.
Well, hey, you've deserved it, that's for sure. We do have a couple questions.
Okay.
One is from Hannah, and she wants to know, what do you observe is a common length of time that people take off from diving and still return?
Oh, well, that's a good question. There's been a lot of discussion about the diver dropout rate. And when I was teaching, most of the teaching I did was in a college environment. And so we'd have students who would take the course, complete the course, but not be able to dive after the course is over, or dive regularly, because again, career obligations or family obligations, and then they come back to the sport. And I'm seeing that a lot because I'm actually getting students who are contacting me that I certified as long ago as the 1970s, who are now wanting to come back to the sport and wanting to know how. And the condition or the issue that I think is critical is that people who want to come back should understand that their skills are not what they were 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago, or even 2 or 3 or 4 years ago. So they need to take an easy approach and take refresher courses. I mean, for example, when I was in Tasmania, it had been almost 3 years since I had made an open water scuba dive. So one thing, I did not take my camera on the first dive because I didn't want to complicate anything. And also I was diving with some people who also had not been in the water for a while, with somebody who had been diving regularly so that they could help to make sure that everything was the way it should be. And I've got over 10,000 dives and been diving since 1964, but I still took that cautious approach. And I think it's important to understand that we can't let our egos get in the way. We can't let anything else get in the way, that if we have not been in the water for a while, we need to take it slow and easy back in again.
Yep. Hey, if you want to unshare your screen right now, Dan, you can get
All right.
all the faces going up.
Okay. Wow.
All right.
Hello, everybody.
I know, it's like, geez. Okay, the next one, someone would like you to elaborate on the geyser side mount.
Oh, well, there's side mounts are really, you wear a harness system and you have one, generally two, because it balances you. And what you do is you have a regulator on the cylinder and it clips into that harness. So you get in the water, the cylinder's loaded into the water, or actually lowered into the water with you. You then clip them into the harness and they're right under your arms as you're diving. Very streamlined, very easy. And when you come back to the boat, simply unclip a cylinder, hand it up to the dive master or somebody on the boat, and do the same thing with both. And then you climb up the ladder.
Yeah, I have seen quite a few people who especially have back issues.
Yep.
That have decided that side mount is really just the best and easiest thing for them to do.
Yep.
And as somebody is getting older in their diving career, easier and nicer is always good to have.
Always the best way to go.
Yep. And let's see. So what can instructors do besides nitrox in cold water to be safe themselves while teaching and diving?
Well, as I mentioned, nitrox is very important, but being comfortable, and that would include the right exposure equipment for the dive. And that to me is also an issue. I've seen a lot of divers who detest the wearing of hoods or gloves. In fact, that was one of the biggest challenges we had when I was at Wright State. In fact, our students actually wore hoods in the pool, and every student in every pool experience had to wear gloves because they were going to be wearing gloves out in the open water anyway. And I didn't want them to have to wear gloves or have that loss of dexterity for the very first time when they're doing an open water dive. So that way they were used to having something on their hands, used to having something on their head. And in fact, I can't remember a situation where we had a diver, even diving in the wintertime during open water dives in December, where we had a student who did not complete the dive without any difficulty. I mean, it was because they were prepared for that kind of diving. So being an instructor, you've got to be as comfortable or even more comfortable than the students you're diving with. And if necessary, wear a hood, wear gloves. And if I'm diving in extremely cold water, I've got dry gloves and possibly heated gloves or a heated vest underneath my dry suit. So you just need to do everything you possibly can to make sure that you're able to deal with any situation that can occur to a student while you're there in the water.
Yep. Okay, why is nitrox better for older divers particularly?
Well, it gives you a safety factor because our risks are a little bit higher. There are a variety of reasons. I actually do a presentation on safety issues for older divers. And so our risks are a little bit higher because our bodies have changed over time. We lose about 1% of our organ function every decade of life. And that can create an issue where your risks increase. Our tissues change, our ability to absorb and eliminate gases is not as efficient, and therefore we need to be more conservative. And if you're using a breathing gas that has less nitrogen, because nitrogen is the offending gas, So if you're in the water for a specified period of time and you're breathing a gas that has less nitrogen, then the risk is going to be lower. And so that's one reason why. And also, I think there is some discussion about whether or not it makes you feel better because you have a lower nitrogen load in your tissues after a particular dive. And that also is important. And I don't think I get as tired as easily when I'm diving as I did when I was using air and doing more aggressive dives.
Great. One person, this is more of a general comment. This is all good stuff, and I've been going through he's been going through the last month, coming back from diving after 19 years.
Well,
Have done multiple refresher pool sessions and gotten a medical checkup, waiting on a dry suit before going to the quarries. I'm 50 and I realize it.
well, good for you. It's good that you've come back, and welcome back to the sport. I think there's nothing that really can keep people from coming back to the sport as long as they do it in a very focused way and they do it in a very cautious way. I think it's something everybody can do. And age is not necessarily a barrier either, because in the talk that I do on the aging diver, the world's oldest recreational diver, active recreational diver now, is 100 years old.
Wow.
He started diving when he was 97. He lives in Chicago. And last summer he was diving in Cozumel.
And that's something we can all aim to do.
Yep. And I'm well on my way.
Now, there's someone also has asked, is there a specific exercise regimen for diving?
Aerobics are good. I think it's hard for me to do pool work because there are no pools anywhere I live out here in Idaho. But if you're going to do pool work, I would do pool work with fins because you're using the same muscle groups. I would do snorkeling. I think that's important. And if you get a chance to do that in the pool, I think that's a good idea. I would do exercises and things with your mask on. And I think using mask and snorkel is a good idea. But in fact, I'm actually doing a podcast coming up on Thursday of this week where we're talking about things that instructors do, and I think it's important for people to learn that exercises are good using the same muscle groups that they would use in scuba diving.
Great. Okay, that kind of wraps up the questions, unless somebody else has something they want to pop in really quick.
Again, email me about any question at any time. I mean, I'm answering questions from people almost every day. So I'll be happy to help you come up with an answer to a question you have or answer the question directly.
Someone wants to know how they can attend the podcast, the seminar.
It's being done by Tech Clark. And I don't know exactly how he does it because I've never done one with him before. But it's called the Dive Locker.
Dive Locker. Okay.
Yeah, and what we're going to be talking about are what instructors can do when they're dealing with older divers.
That's a great thing.
Yeah, I think so too.
Definitely.
Well, it's good. Well, and thank you all for participating in this webinar. I had a good time. I hope you did too.